Hey, hi everyone. My name is Karlee Twiner, and we're going to be talking about the three Ellens, a case study in Irish naming patterns. Now, before we get started, I wanted to introduce myself. As I said, I'm Karlee Twiner. I recently graduated from Brigham Young University with a bachelor's in family history and genealogy. Um, I emphasized in Irish and Southern US research, but I often will do anything in the British Isles or in the US. Um, I did an internship at the Irish Family History Center in Dublin, Ireland for a summer, and I worked at Storied, a new family history platform, for a little while. And I am now a professional genealogist doing client work, and I also take people on genealogy research tours to Ireland and hopefully eventually the rest of the British Isles in order to do more family history research for their families in the archives. So that's just a little bit about me. So let's get started. So the starting question, um, this is a question that we got when I was working at the Irish Family History Center. I was working with Fiona Fitzsimons at Enniclan for a week while I was there, and she does these weekly Facebook lives, and she has people send in questions, and she chooses a couple that she answers. And someone emailed and asked if we could help make sure that what they had for this information on Ellen Egan was correct. And this comes from the Primrose Project, and this is trying to find the girls that were sent from a workhouse in County Galway um, a little bit after the potato famine and find out where they ended up. So the question was, is Ellen Egan, that was sent from a poor house in Galway, Ireland, the same as Ellen Egan, who married William Parker in Ontario, Canada, and the same as Ellen Parker, who died in Ontario, Canada? And so this is the information that we were given. Ellen Egan, she was born in 1838 from the electoral division of Castle Blankeny, and this is in County Galway. She appears in the 1861 Canadian census, where she is living in Toronto and working as a bread maker. She is boarding with Mrs. Gallagher, who is also an Irish immigrant. Ellen Egan marries William Parker in 1862, and they moved to eastern Ontario to an area called Renfrew. They lived in the township of Alice and Fraser. She is recorded as a farmer's wife, and it is also noted that she cannot read or write. The couple went on to have three children, Michael, James, and Mary, born 1862, 1865, and 1869 respectively. In the 1881 Canadian census, the family are living in the townships of Petawana and Mackay, and they've had two more children, Joseph and Ellen. Towards the end of her life, it would seem William and Ellen moved back close to Toronto and settled in a place called Guelph. Ellen Parker, née Egan, died in Guelph in February 1915. The cause of death was recorded as senile changes of arteries. She was 76 years old. So this is actually quite a good amount of information, and this is what the Primrose Project has on hand and is one of the examples that they give to people when they're recruiting volunteers to help them to find these girls. And this was actually sent to the Irish Central News in order to recruit um, people to volunteer to help. So we're going to first start off with Ellen Egan in Galway, because that is really who they're searching for. They're searching for this Ellen Egan who was an inmate at the workhouse. Um, so here's the few things that we know about this Ellen. She was in the Mount Bellew workhouse, which is located in Mount Bellew, County Galway. And according to my research, this actually is not where she would have started, because Mount Bellew opened up about 3 years before she was sent off to Canada. Um, and so she would have been in a neighboring workhouse before they built this one. And she was from Castle Blankeny, County Galway, which is a small township about 3.5 miles from Mount Bellew, so not very far. And it's a good likely case. And she was probably an orphan because she was admitted into the workhouse in 1847, which was the worst year of the Irish potato famine. It's often called the Black 47 because so many people died and immigrated. And this was when she was around 9 years old. And when we look at the image from where they got this information about Ellen, it says that she's 15 and she's being sent away, but there's no mention of parental acknowledgement or like consent, which means that she probably doesn't have parents or they don't know where they are. So let's take a look at that. So this is the workhouse minutes. And Ellen is among 50 other girls that are being sent to Canada. Some interesting information about this is actually that prior to this, there was a thing called the Earl Grey scheme, which is where they would send girls from workhouses, such as this, to Australia and Canada to work as maids in households and other sort of work in other parts of the British Empire because there were so many people in these workhouses. The famine really put a strain on them. I did a lot of research on the potato famine during my time at Brigham Young University, and there were often 200 or so more inmates than were supposed to be in the place at capacity. And so that's why they were sending people out. However, once people got word of this, they weren't too happy that, these young girls were being sent without really any thought to them. And so it became illegal. But in 1852, 1853, when this is happening to Ellen Egan and all 49 other girls on this page and the page before, it's still happening. So even though it's been made illegal, it's still actually going on because what else are you going to do? And so they were being sent to Canada to be workers in homes and things like that. So if you look at this, we have Ellen Egan right here. She is 15. She's been in this workhouse for 6 years, which, as I mentioned, this workhouse has only been open for about 3 years at this point. So she actually started out at a different one. And she is from Castle Blakeney, along with these other girls, such as, let's see, there's Honor, Kathy, and I believe that says Pribby. And it seems like all of these girls are orphans because there's no parental consent given for any of them. And most of them are 21 or younger. There are a few that are a little bit older than that, but most of them are below age, which means that they also can't legally give consent for themselves. The workhouse governor is considered their legal guardian at this point, and so they're able to go out by themselves, which begs the question of, did they actually want to go, and were they happy and excited? Now for the Ellen in Canada. So we know that Ellen Egan in County Galway was being sent to Canada on the Primrose through the port of Limerick. And so we are assuming that she eventually made it to Canada. However, that's not always the case. She could have died. She could have made it to Canada and went down to America, which is a lot of what the Irish immigrants would do, is they would go to Canada and then go down to the United States because it was easier to get into Canada for them as it was part of the British Empire. But boat conditions weren't always that great. However, since this was after the famine had abated, they were a little bit better than the famine ships that a lot of Irish immigrants were carted over in. So this is the records that we have. This is from Ancestry. and it's a church record. And Ellen Egan is getting married in the Catholic Church between 1856 and 1866. Now, that's a very wide range of time. So we don't know exactly when she's getting married. And this is happening in Pembroke, Ontario, Canada, in a cathedral, and she's getting married to William Parker. Now, this, from the surface, seems to be pretty on point for Ellen Egan in County Galway. Because, we're Catholic. Most likely, Ellen Egan was Catholic. She is from the west of Ireland, which was hit the worst during the famine. And so here's some things just to sum up from that. We know that she lives in Ontario, Canada, which adds up for Galway Ellen, as she was supposed to come over to Canada and start working. The marriage is between 1856 and 1866. Around 1856, Ellen would have been 17 or 18, and by the time 1866 rolls around, about 27, 28. That's not a bad range for getting married. 17, 18 is a little bit young, but that's okay. However, we're going to go to the original of this church record. So as we can see, we have William Parker over here, Ellen Egan, and don't worry, I transcribed the important part of this paragraph here because it's a little hard to read, especially with the grainy image. But as you can see, there's a whole lot more words to this than the indexed version that I showed earlier. So the transcription of this says, the 19th day of May, 1862. The publication of the third of the banns has been made at the proof of our parish mass between William Parker, farmer, of this parish, son of age of William Parker, farmer, and Catherine Singleton of Mallow, County Cork, Ireland, on the one part, and Ellen Egan, also of this parish, daughter of age of James Egan and of Mary Donovan, County Cork, Ireland, on the other part. So because we looked at the original record, we have that they were getting married the 19th of May, 1862. So this would put Ellen about 2021. So that works out with her being of age, because being of age is typically 21 years old. And that's when you don't necessarily need parental consent. However, a big part of looking at this original record is finding out that this Ellen Egan was born in County Cork. As has been said before, Ellen Egan from County Galway is from County Galway. And if counties are right next to each other, sometimes that happens where you get them mixed up, or maybe you say that you're from one and you're from the other, or you live in one but the closest workhouse is in the other, so you go to that one. But another thing is, it says that she's the daughter of age of James Egan and Mary Donovan. Now, Ellen Egan was admitted into the workhouse in 1847 when she was 9 years old. Her parents might not have been dead at that point. They might have also been admitted into the workhouse and died later. However, a lot of times in the workhouses, children were separated from their parents at a very young age. If a mother had an infant, she was allowed to keep the infant for a certain amount of time, but then they were separated. And so Ellen probably wouldn't have been with her mother or her father during this time. And it's unlikely that Ellen Egan, at the age of 9 years old, would have known both of her parents' first and last names at this time. She might have. Maybe she hung out with her grandparents on both sides a lot, or her cousins, which is very common. However, it's not as common for them to know the exact names, especially if they're separated at such a young age, either through the workhouse or just through death. And that was also probably a very traumatizing time for Ellen, if we're looking at it, because famine starts in 1845 and 1847 rolls around, so that's 2 years. She was 7 years old when it started. These are things that a 7 to 9-year-old doesn't really think about, and by the time she's 15, she's probably forgotten all about it. Probably honestly lost a lot of hope, which is what happens a lot in the workhouses. So to show you how far away Galway and Cork are, this is just from a general county Cork. Hi, here's my doggy. Here. So I did from general county Cork to Mount Bellew, County Galway. It takes 40 hours-ish to walk. And if you look at this whole of Ireland, Ireland's not that big. And so it's very unlikely that Ellen would have traveled this far by herself, especially, but also with her family. For one, because people weren't really traveling inward in Ireland during the famine. They were usually trying to get to a port so that they could leave if they had the money, which a lot of them didn't. And the famine actually exacerbated the class distinctions, because the middle class were the ones that didn't get enough food, but they had enough money to be able to pay for passage from Ireland to England, Australia, Canada, United States, other places in the world. And so you have a lot of really poor people that end up staying in Ireland, and most of them are in a really bad spot and either go to the workhouses or end up dying. And so it's not likely that someone who lives in County Cork with access to a port such as Cork is going to move into County Galway inland. Now, maybe if they went to Galway City to try to catch a boat there, maybe, but not very likely at all. And then another thing to look at is johngrenham.com. This is where you can get a lot of information about Ireland and Irish family history. John Grenham is a great Irish family historian. And he's put together this thing from Griffith's valuation where you can put in a surname into his search bar and you can see how common it was and where it was most common. Now, here's the fun thing about Egan. Egan is a very common last name. If you look around, you have some, all the way up in the Ulster counties, not as common up in the Ulster counties, though. We have some over here in Cork area, then up here in Galway, and you also have some over in Dublin. You have some everywhere. And so it's not unheard of to have multiple people named the same name, especially when there's so many of them. And it's really in this central corridor right here that goes from Galway down to Cork. And this is from Griffith's evaluation, which was from 1847 to 1864, and is often used as a census substitute since the Irish censuses were kind of destroyed, which is very unfortunate, but there are ways to work around it. So the conclusion from this research is it is highly likely that these two Ellens are not the same. It's not to say that there's, not there's still that 1% chance that they could be, because, I haven't talked to Ellen Egan, but it's very, very unlikely that these two Ellens are the same, given that they were so far apart and Egan is such a common last name. And so many people were immigrating to Canada at that time. And so that brings us to the third Ellen. So we're looking at Ellen Parker. So at this point, we're pretty sure that this Ellen is not going to be the same as our Galway Ellen. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look into it and see if it's the same as the Ontario Ellen. Just to make sure that we're getting good information, especially because remember that this is information that's being used to recruit people to this project, um, to help find these girls. So what do we know about this Ellen? She died in Guelph, Ontario. So this is close to where the second Ellen Egan lived, or at least was married. This one is married to William Parker. Sweet. That's the same name as the second Ellen's husband. So that is checking out pretty well. Hush. I'm sorry. She was born about 1838 in Ireland. Okay, sound familiar? Perfect. Something that is missing here, which probably is missing for a lot of people, is where in Ireland she is from, because as we looked in the Griffiths valuation from John Grenham, Egan is a really common last name, but even so, we don't even have Egan as a last name for this person just yet. We have Ellen Parker. So we want to go look at where we got this information for Ellen. Now this comes from Find a Grave, and we have this tombstone, which you can see Parker down here, but it's a little bit harder to see the smaller transcription or inscriptions on this. And so I've made sure to look and make sure that the information that was recorded on Find a Grave was accurate and that we could trust it, because sometimes people put stuff that you don't know where it came from. And so it's very important to look at the originals when possible. Now, of course, keep in mind that tombstones aren't always the best source of information, because you don't know who put the tombstone up, and when it was put up either, because sometimes people will put tombstones up after the fact. A story I like to tell, this isn't really about a tombstone, but it's about Plymouth Rock up in Plymouth, Massachusetts. We have a friend, his name is Greg Cox, and he and his family lived up in Cape Cod for a little bit, and so we went to visit him. And when we were about to leave to go see Boston, he says, "Oh, you need to go see Plymouth Rock. It's a huge disappointment, but you've got to go see it." And so we had to go see it at that point. So we went, and it's this little rock surrounded by, a box. And it has the date that the Pilgrims landed on it. And then it has a little plaque that tells the history of it. And the person who said that that is the rock that the Pilgrims landed on, he said that 100 years after the Pilgrims landed. And so, is it really the rock? He probably wasn't alive then, to know. And so that's kind of the same as tombstones. You don't know who put it there, if it's accurate, and so you've got to take it with a grain of salt. But if you have nothing else, it's a great starting place. And so looking at this tombstone, this Ellen Egan, or this Ellen Parker's maiden name wasn't Egan, it was Doyle. Doyle is a little far away from Egan. If it was an Egan spelled differently than our Ellen, that would be okay, because there are name variants as well, which is something that you can also see on johngrenham.com. It'll give you variants of the different surnames that you're searching for, which is great, especially if you're using irishgenealogy.ie, or Roots Ireland, because sometimes, especially Irish genealogy, it requires a very precise search. And even with Ancestry and Find My Past and Family Search, and Storied, all these things that you can search for records on, it's always good to try different variations of a name, because it can influence the things that come up in your search. And maybe your you know, John Fitzpatrick was spelled really weirdly, or it was indexed really oddly. And so it's not coming up when you search for it the way that you think it should be. And so it's good to look at those different variations, especially like, McDonald and stuff like that, just to see what possibilities there are. Um, because it could also be that the people weren't literate, and so they just said what their name was, and whoever was listening wrote it down. Like, for example, my name is Karlee, but it's spelled Karlee, which isn't the most common spelling. And so whenever people ask for my name, like, if I go to Starbucks or something, order a hot chocolate, they'll write it Carly. That's not how I spell it. And so if a Starbucks hot chocolate cup was used as a genealogy resource, then you would have to try the other spelling of, or a different spelling of Karlee to probably bring that up. But again, Doyle isn't an alternate form of Egan as far as I am aware. And so this is not what you want to see when you think that you've got something. This just says, sorry, it's not the right one. We need to move on and find a different one. Another thing to note is that Ellen is a common given name in Ireland. You have names like Mary, Ellen, Patrick, John. Things like these are very common names that are given to people. And so you've got to remember that not only are surnames good to check, but also given names, because even if you have a common or an uncommon surname, you might have a really common first name. When I'm doing my Twiner genealogy, Twiner is not a very common name. However, once you get past like 1820, all of them are named John, which makes it really difficult to distinguish which John Twiner is my John Twiner and which John Twiner is a cousin of my John Twiner, and things like that. So it's important to note what names are common, and what names are uncommon. And this can also help you in your search, because if you know that, your Mary Donovan has a sister named, let's say, let's just say that they really like cars, Elantra. Um, Elantra Donovan, you're probably going to want to search Elantra first, because if you can find that one, then you probably know that that is the one that you're looking for, as opposed to if you're searching for Mary Donovan, you might get a whole bunch of them. And so you start with the most uncommon name that you can. And sometimes that doesn't work because maybe it's indexed wrong, maybe it's just not there. But it's a great place to start so that once you find it, you can use that information from, a sibling to find and make sure that you are getting the correct one for your person. And so, as a conclusion, these three Ellens are three separate people. And something that I think is really important in genealogy and family history is making sure that we are choosing the right people, that we aren't just doing it to be like, oh, I found another person in my family tree, which can feel wonderful. And that's kind of how I started out as a younger genealogist when I was like, 15, 16. I was like, oh my gosh, I found it. I found the person. And now that I'm a professional genealogist and I've gone through courses and I've gone to conferences and things like that, I need to go back and check my own work, because I don't know how well I did it and if they were actually the people that I was wanting to find. Because it's I just think it's disrespectful to them. Not like, if we do it unknowingly, then that's different. But if we have the resources in our grasp to be able to distinguish the people and pull them apart and make sure that we're getting the right people, it can help them and it can help us too, because um, we can separate them into individuals and celebrate their lives as well. Because these three Ellens, they are people that went through a lot, because all three of these Ellens were born during the time, or were alive during the time of the Great Famine, which was a terrible, terrible time. And so each of them has their own story that they can tell if we take the time to actually research them and find out what they went through. And so how can we avoid making mistakes that will lead to bringing, three people together that aren't actually the same people, and being able to celebrate each person as the individual and getting to know their own story? Here are a few things that we went over throughout the course of this little case study. And of course, like, I titled it a case study in naming patterns, which is like a really big part of this. But there's also other things that help with the development of this case study. The first is to look at the original document. When possible, you should always look at the document. Sometimes it's not available, like on the Ancestry or Family Search and things like that, because of the use agreements that they have made with whatever archive they got the information from. They might not have been given um, the original to actually be able to put on their website. But usually there is an original somewhere. Sometimes there isn't, which is really unfortunate, but a lot of times there is. And so do what you can to get your hands on that original. You can often find them at the local archives, whether that's online or in person. Sometimes you don't have to go to the archives, and you can just contact them, pay a fee, and get the original sent to you. Um, and this is really important because there's usually more information on those things. So even if you are 100% sure that this is your person, you should still get the original, because you could find out more about them or their family um, by getting the original. Sometimes it'll tell you their parents' occupation, things like that, which can help you distinguish whether or not this person is the same as the person you're looking for. Because maybe it says that this person's parent was a banker, but you know for a fact that yours was a farmer. And it's most likely that those aren't the same person. And so looking at the original is so important, as we saw with this throughout this entire thing. We looked at the original workhouse minutes and saw the information that it gave for Ellen Egan. Then we looked at the original marriage record between William Parker and Ellen Egan, and we found out that Ellen Egan was actually from County Cork. And then we looked at the original, or at least, these are photocopies of the original, but, that's sometimes as close as we're going to get. But the original picture from the tombstone for Ellen Parker, and we found out that she was actually a Doyle, not an Egan. And so it's so important to look at the original. Um, the second thing is to check distances. Do a quick Google Maps search to see if the places are close together and if it's likely that somebody would have traveled from point A to point B. Because if you have, three different options, and one of them is, a mile away, one of them is like 20 miles away, and one of them is, you know, 350 miles away, most likely it's going to be the one that's 1 mile away. Now, even though I'm an Irish family historian, that doesn't mean that I know how close each township is to each other. And so doing a quick Google Maps search helps me immensely in distinguishing between whether or not this person is the one that I'm looking for, or maybe it's more likely to be this person. And that's a quick thing that you can do on a computer anywhere. The third, and this has to do with, the Irish naming patterns is to check if a name is common. And this is both for given names and surnames, because some names are super common. For example, John Smith. If you go and search in the 1900 U.S. Census, if you search John Smith, you're going to get a whole heck of a lot of results. But then some names are not so common. For example, Karlee Twiner. If you go and search a census, there's probably not going to be a Karlee Twiner unless you have access to the ones since like 1998. So like the past 3 censuses. It's really important to know if a name is common or not, because you could have a whole bunch of different people that are named the same in a small area, and that's when it becomes a lot more important to look at the originals, to find out, what their occupation was, who their exact parents were, who the witnesses were, if they share last names, or if, these witnesses have the same last name as the witnesses on their baptism as they do on their marriage. And so you see these family connections, and you use that the family acquaintances and neighbors, or the friends, acquaintances, and neighbors, and you use that to make sure that you have the person that you are looking for, and so that you can bring their story to life. And this is something that I love doing. These 3 Ellens, they're a passion project of mine. I'm not related to them in any way as far as I'm aware. It's just I love bringing stories to life and making sure that everyone has their story told as much as I possibly can help them with that. Um, and so that's why I love teaching people about the ways that we can bring these stories to life, is because everyone that I help to teach to look at this will bring, 100 other people their stories, and they will have all these different sources and things that they bring to the table and say, no, I know that this person is correct. And another thing to note is to always be humble with your research too, because maybe you find something, and then 5 years later a new collection comes out on ancestry, and you look at it and you find out that the thing that you thought was right, you now have something to disprove it. And so it's okay to go back on your research the more that you get. Um, and it's important to move forward like that. Um, and if you have any questions, uh, please feel free to email me. My email is genericgenealogist@gmail.com. I also have Facebook and Instagram, um, and those are generic genealogy. Um, I love helping people out, so feel free to email me, and I'll be sure to get back to you as soon as possible. And especially if you want to help out with the Primrose Project, email me and I can get you in contact with people that are doing it. We need some great Irish researchers, because I think that this project is really, really cool, and also really important to bring to life these poor girls that were sent away from their homeland to a place that they didn't really know. Um, so thank you very much for listening. Um, Again, my name is Karlee Twiner, and I hope to hear more about your researches, or your research, and how you're coming along with your Irish. Thank you very much.